the state government from the area for 2 terms, and then he was asked to run for New York State Governor in 1855, and he did, and I think much to his great surprise, he actually won. So he became the governor for what was then a 2-year term. And it was at the governor's farewell banquet or ball or something in Albany in 1857 that he met the governor's daughter, Mary, was introduced to a young banker from New York City by the name of Fred Thompson. Fred's family had started a private bank in New York City, and several years later they were asked to issue the first American greenback, the first dollars. Before then, each state issued its own currency. So New York had its own currency, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and so on. But in 1862, the first American dollar, U.S. dollar, was issued by Fred's Bank, and that was known as the First National Bank of the City of New York. It's now come to be known as Citibank. You may have heard of it. It's a large international bank now. Anyway, the Thompsons moved, they were married in the summer of 1857 and moved off to New York. And then several years later, in the mid-1860s, Mary decided she would like to reestablish contact with upstate New York and Canandaigua in particular, because this was her home. And she asked Fred if it would be all right if they bought a small place here, which they did. It was a little 8-acre farm, which was off the neighboring street then called Mechanic Street, now called Fort Hill Avenue. The name of the farm was Sonnenberg, meaning sunny hill in German, and they liked the name and they just kept it. There's nothing magic about the name, it was just the name of the farm. And as neighboring property became available over the course of time, they would increase their holdings. They would add to it and buy a piece here and a piece there, and it gradually grew. Well, they liked the old farmhouse, and they came here all the time in the summer, but then Fred was forever going back to New York City on banking business. And Mary felt that the farmhouse really was a little old and a little drafty, and she wanted a more modern house. And as it turned out, in the 1880s, Fred wanted a nice place to entertain visitors, company, and so on. So they tore down the old farmhouse and built the house that's here today. That was built in 1885 to 1887. And then they came here quite often during the rest of Fred's lifetime. But he died in 1899 at the age of 62, quite a young man. And he left everything that he owned to his widow. They had no children of their own, so he left everything to Mary. And overnight, she became an extraordinarily wealthy woman. And as one of my visitors said a little while ago, at that point she began to enjoy herself. And she traveled all around the world and brought back all kinds of ideas about art and statuary and sculpture and music, painting, you name it. And she totally transformed Sonnenberg into what you see today. So this all started in about 1900. And from 1900 until she died in 1923, she transformed Sonnenberg and was forever changing things. And what you see here now today is pretty much the way she left it in 1923. In 1923, when she died, she left it to her nephew, her brother's eldest son. She was one of 5 children, and she had 1 brother and 3 sisters. And the brother was Lorenzo Clark of Detroit, and his eldest son, Emery Clark, was the one that inherited the property when Mary passed away. So Mr. Clark kept it and took a few things from Sonnenberg to his estate in Detroit, but mostly he kept it going the way it was. And then in the late 1920s, he didn't have any need for Sonnenberg anymore, so he put it on the market, and it was advertised in one of these magazines for the very wealthy. I think it was for sale for $1.9 million, and he had nobody wanted to buy it. Well, about that time came along the Great Depression, and in 1930 he was eventually talked into considering an offer from the U.S. federal government to acquire Sonnenberg and all its farm property out to the east and to the north for building a psychiatric hospital for veterans of World War I. And in 1931, he did sell it to the federal government. So what you see today, the house and the grounds, was actually part of the Veterans Hospital, which is just behind us here, over on East Street. And that is still an active Veterans Hospital, not nearly as active as it was right after World War II, but still very active. And it's about to become a center of excellence for psychiatric treatment of people who have served in the United States military. So the house during the VA period served as quarters for the nurses who worked at the hospital, and the grounds served as therapy, so that the patients could come out and, commune with nature, dig in the garden, and so on. But mostly it was just a lovely, quiet place to walk and stroll. And for psychiatric patients, that's a very good thing. Well, that happened until the late 1960s. In the early 1970s, it was about to be declared surplus property and sold to the highest bidder. And a group of people from Canandaigua said, oh, that would be a shame, because it would be developed as a housing development, and all this beauty would be simply lost. So they got together and went to the federal government and said, could we not acquire the 50 acres of the house and the formal gardens as a private, not-for-profit museum, so that we could preserve what Mrs. Thompson had built here in Canandaigua. And in 1973, the federal government deeded over to the private nonprofit this, what is still here today. It's 50 acres of the house and the grounds. And that, for the last 35 years, has been open to the public. We've had some ups and downs over the course of time, but it now belongs to New York State as a state historic park. The state owns the property, but it's operated by a private non-profit corporation, which is called Sonnenberg Gardens, and I'm a volunteer for that organization. We have about 300 volunteers who come out and work here during the course of the year. And anytime you want to come, we're open from mid-May at Mother's Day until the middle of October. Friday evenings, in the summertime, we have our moonlight strolls. Last night we had one here. You can see some of the residue of it as we walk by today. There are light arches and so on. The gardens are lit, and it's just lovely. And we have music up on the veranda, and that's every Friday evening. And then during the week, we have guided tours at 10 and at 1, similar to the one you'll be getting from me today. And other than that, it's open to the public anytime from 9:30 until 5:30. We're open until mid-October, as I say. When the first frost comes, it doesn't look as nice. So.